Hello A&P1 students, this is Gina Piscatelli here, and this is your last nervous system lecture. In it I will discuss the autonomic nervous system, which is part of the nervous system that functions to maintain homeostasis for us, and the effector organs, or the organs that are controlled, will be things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glandular secretions, enzyme control, pupil dilation, things like that. So the autonomic nervous system is famously known for being the nervous system that controls our flight or fight, depending on what we want to do when we're threatened, and then alternates to a rest or digest period, and that would be like Thanksgiving Day, or when you're home from school and just hanging out. So the first part of the autonomic nervous system to discuss is, where does it fit into our classification of parts of the nervous system? Some things that we already know about the nervous system will help us understand what the autonomic nervous system does. So we're going to look at the scheme, in particular this flow chart that you've seen before. So anatomically, we know that the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system includes nerves, and ganglia, which are just groups of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. That's anatomically. But this particular chart breaks down the peripheral nervous system into different types of functions. So when we think of a nerve, it could be a spinal nerve or it could be a cranial nerve. Either nerve type will have both sensory and motor functions, or maybe just one or the other, but often both sensory and motor neurons are located in the nerve. So for the autonomic nervous system, someone decided that it refers to only motor neurons or motor function that innervates visceral structures. And those visceral structures are smooth muscle, and glands, and our heart. So the autonomic nervous system is visceral motor, no sensory component traditionally. And as you can see, the autonomic nervous system has two subdivisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And we'll talk about how they differ in a little bit. So overall, the function of the autonomic nervous system is to maintain homeostasis when our body activities vary in response to our environment or something going on internally. So cardiac muscle contraction has to either speed up or slow down at different times, be more forceful or less forceful at different times. Smooth muscle in your bladder, in your intestine, in the iris of your eye will contract or relax depending on circumstances. And glands such as gastric secretions, there's gastric glands, hormones are made by endocrine glands. Those glands will function at different times depending on the needs of your body. Now, the organs that are innervated by these motor neurons that we consider visceral or autonomic, these organs, we call them visceral organs, right? They sometimes can function independently without any nervous system control at all. For example, the heart. Actually, it's the best example because it's autorhythmic. The heart will beat without any neural input whatsoever, little less than 50 beats per minute. Actually less than that, 30 beats per minute. And that's just due to the fact that sodium leaks into the muscle cells and causes calcium release, and that triggers muscle contraction. However, the autonomic nervous system can fine-tune that heart rate. It can change it, as well as how much blood each beat pumps out of the heart, by either raising the heart rate to a normal 72 beats per minute or lowering it. It can even go above 72. Here are some more specific examples of what the autonomic nervous system does for us. So one key thing that the autonomic nervous system does is it controls how dilated or constricted a blood vessel might be. So the first circle that I drew, the blood vessel has a very large lumen. That allows blood to flow freely. But the second one that I drew, and I just put an arrow by it, is constricted. That decreases blood flow. What causes the constriction or dilation is smooth muscle contraction in the wall of the vessel. And the autonomic nervous system can change how dilated your vessels are in different parts of your body, depending on which organs need oxygenated blood the most. So the autonomic nervous system can shunt oxygenated blood to the organs that need it. And it also helps to maintain some sort of blood pressure, because if your vessels were too flaccid, the blood wouldn't move. Another thing that the autonomic nervous system can do is it can change how fast we breathe, and it can dilate our airways. We call this the airways, the trachea and the bronchi. There's smooth muscle in the wall of our airways, and that's what gets constricted or dilated. And then from studying the eye, you know that the pupil size is controlled by the iris, and that's just smooth muscle. So the autonomic nervous system can control how dilated or constricted your pupil is. In addition, the autonomic nervous system can control movement and contraction in your stomach and your esophagus to some extent, and the intestines, as well as the secretions in your digestive organs. Another interesting thing that the autonomic nervous system can do is it can flood your blood with more glucose when you need it, like fight or flight, and send that blood to the appropriate organs to use the glucose. Or if you have excessive glucose for whatever's happening, like you just had a big Thanksgiving dinner and you have way more glucose than you need, the autonomic nervous system can help you store that glucose. So those are some specific functions, just an introduction to what the autonomic nervous system can do. Now we're going to look at structure of the autonomic nervous system. Specifically, what is the difference between the autonomic nervous system, which is visceral, and somatic? So visceral versus this somatic business. Okay, and when we do that, we'll see there's some differences between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic as well. So there are three different features of the autonomic nervous system that I want to bring up to you. And I hid a couple of them just so that this slide didn't look so crazy to you. So we're just going to deal with this first one, and that is the actual pathways of the neurons from the central nervous system out to the effector organ. And I'll come back to this slide in a minute. So here are the two divisions, parasympathetic and sympathetic, drawn together, but on either side. They would be bilateral, of course, but for simplicity, we just have it on one side here for each. The parasympathetic nervous system, that's the one that's involved with rest and digest. It starts, the motor neurons start in either the brainstem I should say, down in the sacral spinal cord. So cranial nerves and sacral spinal nerves will have parasympathetic motor neurons. The sympathetic division, on the other hand, begins in the central nervous system, specifically in the spinal cord at the thoracic and lumbar regions. So that's where the motor neuron originates and then goes out to the effector organs. So if I go back to this previous slide, you'll see what I mean about the differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic anatomically. We call the sympathetic nervous system the thoracic-lumbar thoraco-lumbar division, because that's where it starts. And the parasympathetic we call the craniosacral division, because it begins in the cranium, the brainstem, and the sacral spinal cord. The second anatomical difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic is has to do with the fact that they both have two motor neurons that go from the central nervous system to their targets. But the two neurons involved are a little different in each of the divisions. So I'm going to show you this next slide because this brings in the somatic nervous system. So somatic motor could start at any region of the spinal cord, and one motor neuron goes out to the effector organ. Just one. That's our lower motor neuron. But if you notice, the parasympathetic that goes to the head, the parasympathetic that goes down low near the sacral region, and the sympathetic that originates in the thoracic lumbar region, all three of those have two neurons in the pathway. So that's a characteristic of the autonomic nervous system, is that there will always be two motor neurons from the central nervous system to the effector organ. In the parasympathetic nervous system, the first neuron's axon is really long. It goes all the way out to the effector organ pretty much, really often to the wall itself. The second neuron in the pathway of parasympathetic is very short. So we find synapses between, we call this the pre-ganglionic neuron, and we call this one the post-ganglionic neuron. We find that these synapses in what's known as a ganglion. That's why they're called pre- and post-ganglionic neurons. So I don't know if I said that very well, so I'm going to try that one more time. Both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system pathways have two neurons from the central nervous system out to an effector organ. So this time I'll trace the sympathetic, and the first neuron starts in the spinal cord, thoracic to lumbar region, somewhere in there. It has a short axon that goes to a group of cell bodies that we call a ganglion, synapses on the second motor neuron, which travels all the way to the target organ. So you have two neurons. One is called the postganglionic. It's a mouthful, isn't it? And the one before it is the preganglionic, and I have that written on a previous slide. Notice in the sympathetic nervous system, the postganglionic neuron is the longest. But in the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron is the longest. So that's the difference. So there's two motor neurons from the central nervous system to the target organ, and here I've written down that there are pre and post ganglionic neurons that synapse. The pre is short in the sympathetic, whereas in the parasympathetic the pre is long. Let's look at the third anatomical difference. Synapses occur in ganglia, but the difference lies in where the ganglia are located, which of course is dictated by how long those neurons are. So if I to the next slide, well, I'll go to the previous one. I think that okay. The sympathetic ganglion is very close to the spinal cord. It's very close. And that's just because it's the first neuron is so short. So the ganglion's close. In parasympathetic, the ganglion is very close to the target organ. In fact, it is often within the target organ. And I'm going to show you that on the next slide. So here we have the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems in a different picture to show you where the ganglia are located in different regions of the body. And I'm going to take the purple parasympathetic first. Remember, the parasympathetic nervous system has a very long preganglionic neuron, and then it goes to the target organ. And look at how short the second neuron is represented in this diagram. This particular ganglion in the bladder, in the genitals, in the gallbladder, in the pancreas, all of these in the stomach, these are called intramural ganglia. And that just means in the wall of the organ. In other locations close to the head, where parasympathetic controls salivation as well as the iris of the eye, those ganglia are not really in the organ, but the second neuron is still really short. The ganglion's close to the organ, but not in it. We just call those parasympathetic ganglia. Now I'll go to the sympathetic, because the sympathetic nervous system is really easy to distinguish anatomically because it has ganglia that are arranged in a chain. And it's shown here as the chain ganglia, and this dotted circle that goes around, I don't want to cover it up, but this dotted circle shows many ganglia close to the spinal cord all the way down the length. So I just can make little dots all the way down the length. that's called the sympathetic chain of ganglia. So right away you know, okay, that's the sympathetic nervous system. That's what it's called. There are also some ganglia that are a little bit farther from the cord that the sympathetic neurons use. We're just going to call those collateral ganglia. They're called collateral ganglia. And you don't have to memorize exactly what organs they go to or anything like that. So in summary, the anatomical differences between somatic motor and sympathetic and parasympathetic is that first, somatic motor, there's only one motor neuron. One motor neuron for somatic. But there's two motor neurons for sympathetic and parasympathetic. So that's the biggest difference. Of course, the effectors are different too, right? So somatic motor controls skeletal muscle, whereas autonomic, sympathetic, parasympathetic controls smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, as well as glands. So the difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic is where they originate in the central nervous system, whether or not the pre or the post ganglion is long or short, and where the synapses occur, meaning where do the ganglia occur. So those are the major anatomical differences. One other difference is where are the neuron cell bodies within the central nervous system. And the brainstem's a little bit complicated for parasympathetic, but if we just think about the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral spinal cord, all the first computer is going crazy again. All the preganglionic neurons, the first neurons that leave the central nervous system, are found in the lateral horn, the gray matter of the spinal cord. But the somatic motor neurons are located in the ventral horn instead. Okay, this leads us to the last part. I think this is actually part 3, not part 2, right? I should really fix that. So it saves correctly for you. Okay, this is the last part, and that is how do the functions differ between parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. First, I need to let you know that a single organ is innervated usually by both divisions, and there's a balance, a continual balance between the two. Input to the organ is balanced. We refer to that as autonomic tone. And usually it's the sympathetic nervous system that overrides the parasympathetic a little bit, but especially in blood vessels. But there are some organs that are only innervated by one division. For the sweat glands are only innervated by sympathetic. So one organ is receiving input from both divisions, and you know that both divisions, or each division, has an opposing effect on the other. Overall, the sympathetic nervous system functions to adapt the body for physical activity. Parasympathetic function minimizes the use of energy. Those two things, if you remember those, you'll be able to predict how an organ is affected by either subdivision. So we're going to look at some examples. This is the first picture that you looked at. I thought it might be nice to just see the same picture again, showing you now in words the differences in function between parasympathetic and sympathetic. So notice that the parasympathetic constricts the pupil, whereas the sympathetic dilates the pupil. That has a significance evolutionarily because we want to be able to see more. Imagine our ancestors who were really fleeing from all sorts of crazy creatures. They needed to see as much as possible, so their pupils dilated. Another good example would be heart rate. So the parasympathetic division slows your heart rate because you're resting, whereas the sympathetic division accelerates the heart rate. And that's because you need oxygenated blood to pump through your body more quickly. There's another slide here that has bigger type, but it lists the same kind of things. It was a picture that I could annotate myself easier. So you can use this for reference anytime you need to. But I'm going to just talk about the specific effects of each and explain about minimizing energy use or preparing for physical activity. So the parasympathetic nervous system minimizes energy use, but it also promotes energy storage. So it decreases the heart rate. You don't need a lot of airflow because you're not using as much oxygen. So the airways tend to constrict. So we call that bronchoconstriction. Another interesting thing that happens with parasympathetic is that it promotes oxygenated blood going to the skin and the digestive organs. So it does that by inhibiting the sympathetic. It doesn't matter, but blood goes to the skin and the digestive organs versus to the skeletal muscles or the heart, which would be involved with fight or flight. The pupil is constricted, and that helps us see objects that are near. So like when you're sitting and reading. Metabolically, the parasympathetic nervous system helps us store energy by promoting glycogen synthesis, particularly in the liver, but also in the skeletal muscle. So what it does is it lowers blood glucose. So think about after you've had a nice Thanksgiving meal or a big meal, your blood glucose is high, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to kick in and lower that for you. At the same time, it's going to promote your digestive tract to contract. We call that motility, to pass the food along the various organs that it needs for digestion and absorption of the nutrients. Now let's look at the specific effects of the sympathetic nervous system, which prepares the body for physical activity. Many of the objectives of the sympathetic nervous system, sorry, I had to cough. Many of the objectives of the sympathetic nervous system is to prepare the body for physical activity, and mainly to get oxygenated blood to the skeletal muscles and to the heart. So it's going to increase the heart rate. It's going to dilate the airways so that we get more oxygen in our bodies. And it will dilate vessels that go to skeletal muscles, the heart, and lung tissue so that the tissue is nice and healthy. That's what the sympathetic nervous system does. But that diverts blood away from the digestive tract and the skin. The sympathetic nervous system also dilates the pupil, but it raises blood glucose, which makes sense. That's the opposite of what the parasympathetic does. And how it does that is it causes the liver to break down glycogen. Glycogen is just glucose in a string, so all the glucoses go into the blood. And we need that blood glucose to be circulating throughout the body so that the heart and the skeletal muscles have an energy source to make ATP and contract. That is the end of the autonomic nervous system and the nervous system in general. Thank you very much.